Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, a collaborative approach to sheep disease.
For example, we're here with 700 sheep. We could be finished here in 3.5 hours, where that could have taken a day and a half in the old system.
And the politics and the practicalities of inheritance tax.
If you analyse the amount of money they have invested in their business, this 1, 2 or 3 million, whatever they decide it's going to be, I mean, everyone is going to have to get involved with it. And certainly my accountant tells me that there will be tax to pay.
First, though, farmers in North Somerset say plans to create saltmarshes to offset the environmental impact of a new power station would be disastrous for their homes and livelihoods. Energy giant EDF is building a nuclear power plant, Hinkley C, on the Bristol Channel. And to offset the number of fish that'll be killed when it's up and running, EDF is looking to create saltmarshes along the River Severn. It needs more than 800 acres and is considering the compulsory purchase of agricultural land. BBC Points West reporter Ross Pollard has been to Kingston Seymour near Clevedon, which is being considered as a possible location.
Dan's been showing me around his dairy farm.
This is my parents' house. My house is behind, and further up the drive is my sister's house. We've also got all the farm infrastructure that we've put in place, the new milking parlour we put in last year.
His family have been here for decades and say news from EDF that their farm is being surveyed and could become a salt marsh is devastating.
So I've got 2 young children who are absolutely farming mad. And, you know, one day I'd love to be able to offer this to them and for them to carry on as a 5th generation. But if EDF goes ahead and creates salt marsh out here, that's not going to be an option for them. You know, they want to flood 800 acres. We're not making land anymore. You know, we can't just go off and, find somewhere else.
Down the road from Dan's farm is Dowlace Farm Holidays. Only sheep are here today, but it's packed each summer with visitors. The Kirk family are worried about their future.
It was shock. It's like, it feels a little bit like an ambush because they were talking of compulsory surveys within 10 to 14 days of their first notice to us. Mm-hmm. And that feels like an attack.
It doesn't make sense to destroy one habitat to create another, and still the fish are going to be killed further down at Hinkley C.
Kind of always hoped that I'd take over the farm at some point and make a living myself out of it. And like Dad said, it's almost an attack on my future.
Kingston Seymour is one of several sites being looked at, including Arlingham in Gloucestershire, where people packed a local meeting recently to find out more information. EDF says it's still very early days and no decisions have been made.
My name's Andrew Cockcroft and I'm Head of Stakeholder Relations for the Hinkley C project. Those people, we really do understand those concerns. Over the weeks and months ahead, we'll be working with them to really get an understanding of the position of their business and what we can do to work together with them in terms of compensation and also how we can adjust our plans accordingly to what their feedback is.
Until information is gathered from these sites, no one knows if their land could become salt marsh. People here say it's the unknown that's the hardest toll to bear.
That report from Ross Pollard. With the leaves on the trees turning, this is an important time of year for sheep farmers up and down the country. The autumn sheep sales are underway. Now, sheep are something we've been focusing on all week on our sister programme, Farming Today, which goes out here on BBC Radio 4 every weekday morning at 5:45, or you can catch it whenever you like on BBC Sounds. Well, sheep prices in general are up this year, but many upland farmers are still reliant on basic payments from government to make a profit. These are being phased out in England and at a faster rate since last week's budget, and they're being replaced with the environmental land management schemes, ELMS, which pay farmers for things like improving soil or planting hedges. Helen Millican's been at a Swaledale sale in Cumbria, where she found hill farmers Richard and Jess Pedley waiting for their ram's big moment in the ring.
There's a real buzz as sale time approaches at Kirby Stephen Auction Mart. Day 3 of the Swaledale Ram Sale.
It's one we look forward to every year.
Big day for you, Richard Pedley. You're selling today.
Selling today. Trade was reasonable yesterday. We've seen an increase in price for the majority breeding lambs this back end. Finished lambs are dearer. Store lambs are slightly dearer than last year. Yeah, our costs keep going up. So while things read like it's good, price-wise, we're not making any more money, and long term it's quite worrying. Well, short term it's quite worrying. Upland farms will really struggle without that basic payment scheme money. At the moment there's nothing really to replace that with.
If the hill farms go, people will miss the sheep. I mean, the Swaledale and the Upland breeds, they're vital in the stratification of the whole sheep breed. The Swaledale, you need to breed the North of England mule, which are tremendous mothers for the fat lambs.
That is one of the biggest issues that we're struggling to get across to DEFRA officials and those that are behind a lot of these new schemes. Back in September, we've had the North of England Mulgam lamb sales all across the north of England. And without the Swaledale sheep, which are bred on the hills, you'll not get a mule lamb.
Meeting up to compare notes are past chairman of the Swaledale Sheep Breeders Association, Will Cockbain, and current incumbent, Greg Dalton.
At the moment, the sheep market is probably as good as it's ever been, but sadly, you ask most farmers how they feel actually about the future and financially how they feel, and they're jolly hard up, to be quite honest. It's a bit of a sad reflection that we're in that stage at the moment. We look after the countryside. We're almost custodians of the countryside, of course.
But as custodians of the countryside, you therefore have a responsibility to farm fewer sheep and farm possibly in a different way.
I'll turn that round, and the farmer's first responsibility is to himself and his family to make a living. And if the government wants other things involved, like environmental stewardship and the rest of it, there needs to be incentives and schemes put in place to reward that. Most hill farmers have been in environmental schemes for years, yet the basic payment scheme was still the bigger payment, so it's just leading to a decline in incomes, which is now starting to lead to some quite dramatic change.
I mean, I have a young family. Do I want to encourage them into farming at this present moment in time? I'm not sure. That is the worry. If we want farm to continue, we need younger generation, and if the businesses aren't good enough and the money doesn't stack up, we'll go and do something else.
So when we read headlines in the local papers focusing on the buoyancy of the market, what really lies underneath is something much more complicated.
It's undoubtedly true that there is a buoyancy in the market, but there's a buoyancy in the market because the UK sheep flocks contracted, European sheep flocks contracted, even New Zealand and Australia's contracted a little bit. But the buoyancy in the marketplace isn't making up for the loss of income coming from other schemes that we used to have. So what we need is some common sense and some schemes that keeps farming families and rural communities together, rewards farmers for being farmers, and rewards farmers for protecting and enhancing the environment.
Hill farmer Will Cockbain at the Kirby Stephen Ram Sales in Cumbria. DEFRA told us our focus will be on making sure funding is used to the best effect for food, farming and nature, and that our schemes work for farms who have been too often ignored, such as small, grassland, upland and tenanted farms. Now, one of the sheep industry's most enduring health and welfare challenges is scab. It's an itchy condition caused by mites. It's controlled either by injecting a dose of medicine or the traditional dipping of sheep. But increasing resistance to the injection method means more and more farmers are moving back to sheep dip. Organophosphate dip is toxic and can harm human health and pollute waterways. Anyone buying or using sheep dip now needs a certificate of competency. Because of that, professional mobile dipping contractors are becoming more common. Nancy Nicholson has been to see a mobile set-up in action on the islands of Lewis and Harris in a project by the Morden Research Institute.
Hey! So we're watching some sheep being plunged right down into a bath, so they get dipped twice.
Yeah, and you should see a difference in your sheep within a few days, because they're not scratching everything, so they can carry on eating rather than concentrating on scratching and losing weight.
That bath is a giant tank on the back of a lorry filled with organophosphate dip. The action's taking place in Shawbost on the west side of Lewis, and the mobile dipper is a game changer for crofters who've gathered with their sheep from miles around.
I've taken 20 lambs up here today, and my sheep were on the moor, which we gathered the other day. It's great, this new machine. It's absolutely fantastic.
What would you normally do? Would you have to dip them yourself?
Yes, we'd have to drag them over to the dipper, and that's not an easy job to do. Hard on the muscles.
Seems to be an older generation that are taking to do with sheep. There's not a good uptake with the youngsters, so there's a lot of pressure, I suppose, put on the ones that are more fit to be able to be more hands-on and to be doing things. Plus, it's not nice working with the dip either, and it can be quite dangerous in some cases.
We're able to dip upwards of 15 sheep at a time, whereas with the old system of doing it manually, we've got one animal going through a swim-through dipper. For example, we're here with 700 sheep. We could be finished here in 3.5 hours, where that could have taken a day and a half in the old system.
Ali Williamson, you're one of the bigger producers on the island. How much of a problem is sheep scab here?
Last year it was more of an issue, and we've been able to, through the project last year, make a big dent in the amount of sheep scab that's visible. We're hoping to dip upwards of 30,000 sheep. It means that the island has the possibility of getting close to eradicating sheep scab. We are very fortunate throughout Lewis and Harris that we've had a huge buy-in, and this year, being it our second year, we've actually, the ones who didn't do it last year are actually bought into it this year. I am fortunate enough to go around the island and see quite a lot of sheep throughout the island. I can see a massive difference that it actually has made to the overall health of the local flock.
How will you be able to keep the problem out when some people overwinter sheep on the mainland, or you have to buy taps in?
That's always going to be an ongoing issue with us because we have 3 ports of entry to the island, but our main goal at the moment is education. We're trying to educate people with buying in tups about their isolation and any diseases that they may have, so that we can, as a whole and as a community, bring the overall health of the island's flock up to a level.
Crofting is traditionally a communal activity. Is this a really good way of reviving that spirit?
Absolutely no doubt about that. There's many men and women at this fank just now who wouldn't have seen so many animals at the fank and so many people together. And that's been one of the major things that's come out of this that we never expected. The community collaborative effort. Folk are all coming with their cups of tea and their flasks, and that stuff hadn't happened for years. And it's been a real community benefit and a real community buzz about it.
Nancy Nicholson reporting there from the west coast of Lewis. Over a week on from the budget, feelings are still running high over some of the changes farmers are facing. There's the increased rate of withdrawal of basic payments to English farmers, the carbon tax on imported fertiliser, and then there's the main subject of debate, the introduction of inheritance tax of 20% for farmers and landowners with £1 million worth or more of assets. The Ulster Farmers Union has held what it called crisis talks with food businesses this week, saying that including farms in inheritance tax and not ring-fencing the agriculture budget will be a massive blow to Northern Irish farmers. And in Wales, farmers meeting for NFU Cymru's AGM in Ceredigion told the BBC's Stefan Messenger what they thought of the tax.
So my name's Leisha Tudor, so originally from a farm near Aberystwyth, but I moved up to farm with my partner near Tywyn now in Mid Wales.
What do you make of this news about the inheritance tax? How worrying is it for yourself?
So it's quite worrying being from a family farm and then moved up to my partner's family farm now as well. The main messages coming out of the conference today has been around, the long-term sustainability, food security of family farms, and unfortunately this inheritance tax goes completely against the messaging that we're hearing today. So yeah, it is a very big worry.
My name is Bernard Llewellyn and I farm at a place called Carrick-Henning Castle near Llandilo in Carmarthenshire. I think it's probably concerning to the huge majority of Welsh farmers, particularly livestock farmers, because if you analyse the amount of money they have invested in their business, this 1, 2 or 3 million, whatever they decide it's going to be in the end, I mean, everyone is going to have to get involved with it. And certainly my accountant tells me that there will be tax to pay as far as the land has been handed on is concerned. And that really, I don't mind if it was me who had to pay it, that's my choice, but certainly to hand really debt to the next generation, I think is very, very short-sighted.
You said it would mean the end of the family farm, full stop.
Well, I think that is almost inevitable in many cases, because with what you've got to pay and what you've got to pay out, I mean, no one in their right mind are really going to take that sort of debt on.
Well, in Parliament, the new leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, called it the cruel family farms tax. And some are concerned that it will mean that when a farmer dies, their family will have to sell some or all of their land to pay it. The National Farmers Union met with DEFRA and the Treasury earlier this week, and after that meeting, President Tom Bradshaw said the union and government disagree on how many farms will have to pay.
The Treasury is saying only 27% of farms will be within scope of these changes. DEFRA's own figures suggest that 2/3 of farms will be within scope. I mean, there's certainly no resolution today. We've made very passionately our perspective clear that this tax change is completely unfair. And now there are many, many family farms right the way across the United Kingdom that are worried for their future. Something has to change. I have never seen the weight of support, the strength of feeling and anger that there is in this industry today. Many of them want to be militant. Now, we are not encouraging that in any way, shape or form. But government need to understand that there is a real strength of feeling behind what this change means for the future of family farming in this country.
NFU President Tom Bradshaw there. The DEFRA Secretary, Steve Reed, told Anna Hill the changes will raise more money for public services and stop people buying land just to avoid inheritance tax.
I don't think it helps farmers or anybody else if wealthy individuals are able to buy up land as a means of avoiding their inheritance tax liability. But it isn't just that. I'm going to be absolutely honest with you here. We think that, the wealthiest landowners and the wealthiest people in the sector can afford to contribute more at that point. But I said we're going to be fair and proportionate in doing this. And under the changes that have been proposed, 73% of claimants will still pay nothing at all in inheritance tax. And those farms will pass from one generation to the next, as they always have.
You say you're being fair and proportionate, but the words being used by farmers about this change are betrayal, vindictiveness, the death of the family farm, bringing the industry to its knees.
Well, I've heard that language, and first of all, it's important to say this. I understand the anxiety that people in the farming community, that farmers feel about any changes that are being proposed. Changes after, several decades of a system operating in one way are always going to be unnerving. However, that doesn't mean that people should believe every single headline that they read. Many of them have just been simply misleading. Based on the claims for the last year we have information available, 73% of claimants would pay nothing.
The problem is there's a dispute about how many farms will be impacted by this change. The Treasury says the majority of farms won't be affected, and that's what you're saying. Strutt and Parker told this programme the majority of farms will be affected. Who is right?
Well, I don't recognise these alternative figures that are being bandied around, I'm afraid. The figures that I'm relying on and the figures that the Treasury are relying on are hard data. They're from HMRC, and it's based on the number of claims in the last year for which data is available. That should say to people, it gives people some reassurance that the vast majority of farms will be able to pass on to the next generation without incurring a liability. For instance, if you've got a couple who own a farm and they want to pass it on to their son or their daughter, one partner predeceases the other, each of them has a £1 million APR threshold that they can pass on. You add those two together, that's 2 million, plus the 1 million that a couple can pass on to their children in any case, that's 3 million. So up to £3 million, many people will not have to pay anything in APR.
Farmers are really angry about this. The NFU says many farmers, and I quote, want to be militant because they're so angry, and they say something has to change. Are you going to consider making any changes at all?
Well, this is a fair and proportionate way of going about plugging the hole in the finances that has caused such disruption to our economy over the last decade and beyond that.
You've also announced a faster phasing out of direct payments to farmers in England. That's pretty late notice, isn't it, for businesses which need to make plans well in advance. Is that fair?
Well, I make no bones about the fact that there were some very difficult decisions taken in this budget, but people know that BPS was going to be phased out anyway. It's not really offering value for money, and what I wanted to do, frankly, was protect the ELM schemes that part of the farming budget. And as a result of that, we're looking at £5 billion being spent in the farming budget over the next 2 years. That's the biggest budget ever for food production and nature in our country's history. Now, farmers were telling me before the budget was announced that they wanted this government to protect that kind of funding for farming and for agriculture, and we've done it.
Yeah, but they didn't ask you to do it by reducing their payments much faster than they expected.
No, I'm sure, everybody would like, as much money as they can get out of every single scheme. But in the real world, there's £22 billion black hole in the public finances, and protecting the agriculture budget, protecting the ELM schemes meant taking difficult decisions elsewhere. So although I'm sorry that we've had to do it, I think it was the right thing to do, because I want to support those farmers who are in the ELM schemes like SFI, who are moving to different, more nature-positive models of farming. I think that's not just environmentally more sustainable. I think in the long term it's more financially sustainable for farms as well. And I wanted to send the signal that we're supporting farms in that way.
And finally, we've heard on the programme from farmers still waiting for money from the Farming Recovery Fund. Now, that's the cash promised to farmers who were affected by last winter's floods. You've increased the fund to 60 million, but when will the money get to farmers who are still sitting on soggy ground, I have to say?
Absolutely right. And I'm glad we're ending here on a positive, because another thing farmers were saying to me very clearly is that they want that flood recovery money through the Farm Recovery Fund. We've increased it to 60 million. Letters have gone out from the RPA as it happens today. So I hope some of your listeners will be receiving those letters over the next day or two, and we can make sure that money gets out the door to help them recover from the huge damage caused by the floods last year.
The Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Steve Reid. There is still some confusion about how much inheritance tax farmers will have to pay. The rules say tax is due on assets over £1 million. With other allowances, that's £2 million. But in that interview, Steve Reid mentioned a figure of £3 million. The government, though, points out that if people pass on their farm more than 7 years before their death, known as gifting, then no inheritance tax would be due. Well, to try to get to the bottom of the practicality, Kaz Graham's been speaking to Rob Hitch. He advises farmers across the north on tax affairs for the accountants Dodd & Co, based in Carlisle.
Each individual would have up to £1 million of agricultural property relief or business property relief available. But alongside that, they'll also have a normal nil rate band that everybody gets, which is £325,000, and potentially a residential nil rate band of £175,000. In most farm cases, that would cover the farmhouse or part of it. So each individual, in theory, gets £1.5 million. And I suppose for a married couple or civil partners, that would equate to £3 million between them.
What about the detail then? Does a couple on a farm, because you're talking about if there are two people on the farm, does that ownership have to be a legal business partnership, or do they just have to be married or in a civil partnership?
At the moment, the residential nil rate band and the basic nil rate band are transferable between spouses, whereas agricultural property relief or business property relief appears to be not transferable. So in a husband and wife situation, if all the property is in wife's name, for argument's sake, and husband owns none of it, then he won't get to use his £1 million nil rate band because he doesn't have any assets that qualify.
And what if the farm is already owned by a kind of family partnership? Presumably tax is only liable on the percentage of the farm held by the person who has sadly died.
Absolutely. And that also takes into account what's the net value, how much debt is against it, what liabilities are in that business as well. If the farm's worth 2 million, but there's £1 million of debt on it, then potentially there's only £1 million of equity that's chargeable.
Yeah. What are the measures that farmers can take if they want to ensure that they'll be able to hand their farm on to the next generation?
Well, I think a lot of the businesses I talk to probably already make gifts during lifetime. And I think that will become the norm. So I think there are things that can be done for people that have got time to make those gifts and survive the requisite 7 years.
What do you advise farmers who are worried? I know you've got a bit of a traffic light system, haven't you?
I've got a green light for anyone that's basically 60 or younger. For the vast majority of people, you can plan at that point in time. The people in the amber category, between 60 and 70 or 75, they should live 7 years. They can make gifts, they can do things. I think the category in the red light section are probably those over 70 or 75 who, we've had the same rules for 40 years and then suddenly they changed overnight. Those sort of people don't have the opportunity to give it and be secure that they will live 7 years and drop it out of their estate. And that seems blatantly unfair. If you're in that category, you'd be lobbying government for some sort of transitional relief.
Farming tax advisor Rob Hitch. And that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Heather Simons. And Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.